Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. And today I'd like to talk about social dislocation and what it's like to not feel at home where you are, or how, where is home? And the story of Ezra and the returning exiles, the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra and then Nehemiah, tells you a lot about their social location. And that also another aspect of this, the Bible is way more Persian than you realize. That so much of how the Bible was compiled, especially in the Second Temple period, how Judaism formed, which really happened in that period. What we called being Jewish today comes from that period. Doesn't come from the Israelite period as much as it comes after the exile, because the exile was the pivotal change, the pivotal event. It is. Coming out of Egypt, of course, is the event that we always hear about from Moses. But as far as a historical event that we know, that we have a lot of evidence for, the Babylonian exile and then the return and the Persians, and how it links in with the rise of the Persian Empire, is really where we get what we understand Judaism and the Old Testament, frankly, because that's when it was compiled. The Old Testament wasn't compiled in Moses' time. It was compiled in, before, during, and after the exile, most of it. Even some was much, much later in, as I've spoken about, and we've learned too. But the important part of here is about who has home and where it is. It has a lot to do even with the present day Israeli Palestinian conflict. But it really has, it's a story that you hear over and over again. So I'll mention a little bit about a Korean teacher of mine, a professor I had, who was the dean of the seminary I went to, and I had just a fascinating conversation with him, and that he then put it into a book that he had written. So let's begin by talking about the exile. Uh, the the exile, happened in pieces, and that's something that people don't quite realize. If you read the book of Jeremiah, especially, you can get a sense of it. Is that really the kingdom of Judah was pretty much, or was very weakened by the death of Josiah. Judah was always in between major kingdoms, between the Babylonians, Assyrians, the Hittites earlier on, the Egyptians, and we're always just trying to find a way to survive in this environment. All of those small kingdoms there, and it included Moab and Edom and other and other kingdoms as well. But of course, we know a lot about Judah because that's what the story is about. Well, the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar, the were slowly being pulled away, and that most of the people actually did not get exiled. Um, it was the elites, it was the teachers, it was the priests, and of course, because these books are priestly books and come from these people, that's why it was it's portrayed as a bigger event to them than probably your average person living in Judah. A shepherd in the hills, a farmer, the tribal families that were there. These people, a lot of them were left behind, and it was the elites that were taken off. And I wouldn't say only the elites, but the elites and their servants and everyone else. So when they come back, well, first of all, a couple things happen. One is that Nebuchadnezzar dies. He's replaced by Belshazzar. When Then the Persians take over, they conquer Babylon. This is the second Babylon, by the way, not an earlier one. And there's lots of politics about what happened. But the Persians take over, and that's when we get King Cyrus. And King Cyrus is mostly thought of today um, very positively. Most Christians, most Jewish readers of Scripture say, oh, yeah, King Cyrus, he was a good guy. He was a man, after God's heart and all this stuff, even though he wasn't a Christian. There's a little clue in that, by the way. Um, and it was Cyrus that said, you know what? You exiles go back to Jerusalem and reestablish the temple. There's a lot of discussion about maybe the Persian Empire was the first one to experiment with the idea of, instead of just conquering and imposing their rule on these other kingdoms, that the Persians, one of their innovations was to allow people in their cultures to keep their culture and keep their religion as long as they were paying tribute and um, to the king. We see this quite a bit in the Persian period. We see it with Cyrus. We see it with Xerxes later on. Is that he kind of didn't care what religion you were. He, of course, was a tyrant and all of that. But the idea was that by having a vassal kingdom in Judah that was practicing and had their own temple, as long as Cyrus was able to control them and get tribute from them, then then it was a good thing for them to rebuild their temple. The Romans, of course, did this and like crazy. They were able to expand so much and become so large, not by crushing their enemies. Of course, they did when they needed to, but a lot of it was to subsume them under the cult, under the imperial cult, essentially. You can worship your own gods. In fact, we'll give you a little bit of freedom and some dispensations for yourselves, as long as you pay tributes and as long as you look up to the emperor and worship the emperor. Um, you could say that's probably what the Persians were doing too, and maybe the Persians were even the innovators of this idea. Uh, and but even the Romans, way more than we realize, is that the Romans gave the Jewish people many dispensations, gave them much more freedom than some other communities when it came to the religious part of their practice, because they realized that was the best way to control them, was to if you control the priests in the temple and get them to stay out of politics. Might sound familiar, right? You may just get those religious people to stay out of politics, as long as they're paying their taxes and as long as they keep rebellions from happening. Good, great. That's what we're seeing with Pilate, for example. That's what we're seeing with Herod. Herod was nominally Jewish, right? But of course, nobody confuses Herod with a religious person, really. But Herod was um, basically a king put in place to keep the people under control. So think that, and think that in terms of the exiles and in the exilic period. So Cyrus says, "Go back," and Ezra, the book of Ezra, is about this. So it says right off the bat, starting in Ezra 1. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia's rule, to fulfill the Lord's word spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Persia's King Cyrus. The king issued a proclamation throughout his kingdom, it is also in writing, that stated, Persia's King Cyrus says, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me to all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. If there are any of you who are from his people, meaning the Israelites, or the Judahites, may their God be with them, and they go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build a house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Notice that Cyrus isn't saying my God necessarily, but he's willing to say, yeah, your God's cool. And those who remain in the various places where they are living, let the people of those places supply them with silver and gold and with goods and livestock together with spontaneous gifts for God's house in Jerusalem. In other words, we're going to send you off, and um, and when we send you off, we'll support you. So he's saying, I'm going to do that. That's why Cyrus is seen as a positive figure. In modern sort of Christian nationalists' words, it's like, well, Cyrus was not a Jew. Cyrus was maybe even not a believer in the Israelite God, in Yahweh, but he's a good guy, and he was God's instrument, right? People will say that about evil characters today. They say, well, he's not really a believer, and he's kind of he's not a good guy, but he's God's instrument, right? I hate it when people do that. They use historical figures that way without understanding what's going on. The thing is that in a lot of ways, the people had already, the leaders, the priests, we read about this in Ezekiel too, right? Is that they were subsumed into the Babylonian Empire and then the Persians, and they picked up a lot of their habits. And there was a lot of concerns about, are they being faithful? Do they keep their faith? A lot of the stories we have, especially like Esther, for example, like Daniel, are tales about how the Jews kept their faith and kept their religion while in exile. The part that they don't talk about very much is the fact that there were a whole bunch of people back in Judah that were just living and doing the same. So when the the exiles came back to Judah, there was major division, and a lot of Ezra talks about the fact that there was division between the people who were already there and the people coming back. And you can imagine this is 50 years. So these are not the same people, at least 50 years. These are not the same people who left. These are the children and grandchildren of the people who were exiled. So you can see the grandchildren are coming back to Judah, talking to the grandchildren of the people who were left behind and saying, okay, now it's our land. We're in charge again. We're the chief. We're the priests. We're the merchants. We're the powerful people. And we're going to come back and impose our rule on you again. Well, you can imagine that was not well received. You always have to remember that Ezra and Nehemiah were both written by priests who had a one side of this. So they looked on the people that were left behind as faithless, as not keeping the rites, not keeping their religion. So there's actually some brutality in this and saying that they're utterly evil. Well, what they're doing basically is imposing their will. So we're seeing conquest. We're seeing a reconquest of the people of Judah by people who were exiled 50 years before, and their children and grandchildren are coming back and reimposing their will. The parallels, of course, to Israel and Palestine today are, are fit well. And you could say, do the people returning exiles, do they have a right to a homeland? Yeah, but do they have the right to impose their will and to brutally suppress the people that are already there? No. So that tension is always there. What do you do with people who were displaced? We see this a lot in the diaspora of all kinds of communities. We saw this, for example, after World War II, and the refugees that went back to Germany from Poland and the East. A lot of them were treated brutally, even though they were Germans and part of the Nazi regime. Did they deserve to be treated the way they were? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But it's messy. It's complicated. Do the people whose land was taken by them generations before, during the war, do they have a right to repatriate that land to themselves? Very, very complicated, and such a big part of global politics and global relations today. Well, I mean, it was just the same for this. And this is what we're seeing in this story, the return of the exiles. Because we're seeing it from Ezra's point of view, and we're seeing it from the priest's point, the priests and the rulers' point of view, the exiles' point of view, we tend to think they're the good guys and that the people who were left behind were the bad guys, or they were just stubborn and they should just give up their land and give up all the things that they had built over a couple of generations. So it's important to be sensitive to that when you're reading this. This leads to Ezra and Nehemiah actually being triumphalist in a way that's often misused. So I had an interesting encounter with the dean of my seminary. His name is Roger Naum, and he's a major Old Testament scholar. Has written quite a bit. He's a Korean American man, and he's Presbyterian. So I had a great meeting with him. As a Presbyterian, he would reach out to the Presbyterians in this Quaker seminary and to try to keep touch with some of the other people in the seminary. And he was taught. We were talking about Ezra and Nehemiah a little bit, and I said, it's really. I'm fascinated. Why are you? Because he was writing a book on Ezra and Nehemiah. He was updating a major um, uh, commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's published now. So look for Roger Naum and Ezra and Nehemiah. You'll find some really great writing there. But anyway, I said I'm really puzzled, honestly. Why are you a Presbyterian? Why did you choose Ezra and Nehemiah? He's an expert in Hebrew. He knows the Hebrew Bible so well. You could have chosen anything. Why these two books? Because they're used by Christian nationalists and evangelicals in this triumphalist way, really badly. They they don't see the people who read Ezra and Nehemiah in this triumphalist way, don't see both sides of the story. They have no empathy for the people that were left behind. And he smiled with a knowing nod. He goes, "That's exactly why I'm writing this commentary, because I want people to see the complexity of this relationship." And then he told me a story. Um, and it's in his book. It's the preface of his commentary. And the thing I love about commentaries is really commentaries, well written commentaries, obviously have the verse by verse commentary, talk about history and so forth. But the really great commentaries, and this has always been true, even all the way back to Calvin, was will tell you something about the person who's writing it and their social location and who they are. And that is very, very important, because then you can understand the point of view from which they are interpreting the scripture and the way they're analyzing it. So Dr. Nam wrote in his preface about his personal experience in a way that was just fascinating. He was very gracious and gave me a PDF of this before it was published, and asked me to read it, see if I had any comments on it, and also just to see his point of view. I think he was quite proud of it, actually. But he talks about his children. He was bo- he was born in Korea. He moved to the United States as a child, so he has an American accent. He's thoroughly Americanized, right? So many people who are immigrant families are like this, where you have people from the old country. You speak the old language in the household, but the children look, act, talk like Americans, and that's him. So he had an opportunity after he married and had children. And he was in business for a while. He wasn't a theologian his whole life, but he was a businessman. So he and I had a connection in that respect too, because I am also a second career pastor and have a lot of business experience. So we talked about that, and he said he had an opportunity to go back to Korea for business, to get a job, basically for for his work. And he took his children with him. So he was a Korean American, but thoroughly Korean in that he spoke Korean fluently, had Korean parents, and he was bringing his family back to Korea so that he could work. And of course, for him, integrating into Korea was kind of a known thing. Been there a lot of times, kind of knew what it was like to be an American in Korea. But his children struggled a bit. And because his children grew up in the United States, they knew Korean too, but they didn't know Korean fluently. And they learned it just because Korean was spoken in the household. They go back there and they don't fit in. Um, they struggle with it. They're not sure. Everyone around them says, "Well, you're Americans. You're not Korean." And they go, "Well, yeah, no, but I'm Korean. I mean, I speak it. I feel affinity for the culture." And then they talk about how really, even as the children of immigrants, how they didn't feel fit in the United States. Are they American? Or are they Korean? And they're both, and they're in between. And I think and Dr. Nam also was kind of explaining his experience as well. Are you Korean? Are you not? Because being the child of immigrants. What gives me a lot of empathy for this is I have a few people in my congregation. I have an Ethiopian family in my congregation that has been in the United States for three decades. But they and their children were born and raised in the United States. They speak mostly English, but there's some of their native language in spoken in the home. And and when I told them this story, they go, "Oh yeah, that's what it's like being an immigrant in the United States. That's what it's like being really an immigrant anywhere else." I also said that I lived in Germany for 5 years, and I never really intended to stay there for my whole life. I could have, but I decided not to. Um, and even though I'm a white person with Western outlook and Christian and all of that, uh, you know, I got a really good sense of what it was like to be an immigrant when I did that. Now, of course, when I go to Asia, and I've been to Asia many times, you really feel it because there's not only just the cultural differences, language differences, but there's also racial differences. I mean, I stand out. When I take the subway in Seoul, and I'm the only white person on the white Western person on the subway, I get looked at. Especially if I'm with other American white people, which has happened many times. If you've done that, you know what it feels like, and you know how that is. If you're an immigrant or the children of immigrants, you know what this feels like. So that's what I love so much about this perspective and being able to see Ezra and Nehemiah from both sides. You can't, if you look at it only from the triumphalist side, you're doing yourself and everyone else a big disservice. So this is part of the reason why in my denomination, growing up, I didn't really learn that much about Ezra and Nehemiah, nor the Chronicles, uh, because the idea is that those aren't reliable for some reason. In my denomination, in other Reformed people tend to look at Samuel and Kings as the more reliable, the earlier accounts, instead of looking at Chronicles, which are obviously complete rewrites. Sometimes they were just lifted word for verbatim, word for word. Other times there's complete rewrites and changes to the story. I had an Old Testament professor said, well, one of the challenges of being Presbyterian, which has a history of being literalist or fundamentalist, even though we aren't today, is that, or sola scriptura especially, is that you tend to look at things without their cultural context. And a lot of evangelicals today who use scripture this way have that problem too, is they look at the scriptures without their cultural context. So, as a Presbyterian who's in this sort of intellectual world, looking at these scriptures and discounting Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, uh, we're doing the same thing that people who look at these passages without their cultural context do as well. So, in other words, we're all in the same soup. So it's very eye-opening to realize, and what Dr. Nam's doing with his commentary, it's very eye-opening to say, no, what's being talked about is cultural appropriation and integration. How do people of different cultures, especially if they're returning to a land that used to be in, how does that work? So that's one of the fascinating things about it. Um, the other thing that needs to be understood too, as I mentioned, is that uh, the complication of rebuilding the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah is described because Cyrus really wanted them to go there. Xerxes, I never pronounce it right, but the king after Xerxes or after Cyrus, whose name Xerxes, and then they had to prevented them from rebuilding, and it took until King Darius to get the project going again. So even for them, they never, because the Persians were over them, they really didn't have control anymore. Where this comes back is we see many examples of Persian um, influences on Scripture. Now, we could even, it depends on how extreme you can take this, because you could say, well, the pre exilic writings are preserved today or were preserved enough that they didn't get too much Persian influence. But you could even argue that, for example, that the book, or that in Genesis, the story of Gilgamesh uh, is the proto Noah, and there are several places where you see um, much earlier writings coming into the Bible. Some of it verbatim. The Code of Hammurabi in Exodus. Some of it is almost verbatim from the Code of Hammurabi into Exodus, and of course, the Code of Hammurabi is many hundreds of years earlier. Same thing, like I said, mentioned the Gilgamesh. Some people say the Tower of Babel. That story comes into the Bible from much earlier tales. So the question is, did they come directly from the Assyrians, Babylonians, or did they come through a Persian influence? There are arguments either way, because it looks like it could have been these are Persian stories that made their way in, and because of the hegemony of the Persians over the Second Temple period, that there was a lot more Persian influence than we realize. So that the Bible contains a lot more of that. You can even go to the point of saying that that is true in the New Testament. You can, as you get closer and closer to the New Testament in the latter periods of and so much influence there, and there's the Seleucids, there's the Hashemons, and other kingdoms happening, and of course in the Greeks, Alexander the Great came through the land too. So all of these were influencing the theology of the Jewish people, and that theology becomes steadily more dualistic as we go through this period. This is where you start beginning to see, for example, heaven and hell as a dualistic view of heaven and hell come from this period. This is where you start seeing Satan being described as a character. The book of or Zechariah and Job are the only two places in the Old Testament where Satan is an individual character. Now, there were earlier references to evil spirits and things like that that were lifted and brought to that. So some people say, like Isaiah, where he talks about uh, the morning star, which then turned into Lucifer, which is really kind of a crazy story. But you can look at other parts, especially in the Psalms, where dualism didn't come from those earlier writings. Dualism was imposed upon them. And you definitely see that in some of the later, right? You see it in Job, which, especially the prologue of Job, is probably much later, one of the last later books of the Bible. I spoke about Daniel, about how Daniel is probably the last book of the Old Testament that we have. Um, that it comes, during the Maccabees and in that period, and not what it was written about back in Nebuchadnezzar's time. It's Esther is this way too. Ruth, it looks like Ruth came quite a bit later too, kind of looking back. So why is that important? One of my New Testament professors said if you really want to understand the New Testament, you really have to read the Apocrypha. You have to read the Maccabees, you have to read Tobit, you have to read Sirach, the wisdom and so forth, because that was the soup in which Jesus came in. That was the intellectual soup in which Jesus came into on the scene, and that the things that look like dualism in Jesus' words, you especially look at Matthew 25 and the parable of the sheep and the goats. That is a very dualistic passage. Or you look at what is it, Luke 16, where he's about the rich man, speaking across the chasm to Lazarus, his servant. That imagery is very Persian. It's very Zoroastrian. The Zoroastrians came a few centuries before Christianity and greatly influenced Christianity. And a lot of the imagery we have comes from that. And you got so it's kind of funny when Christians think that everything's in univocal, comes in a line straight from from Genesis to them, and that God's plan is just this one straight line, without realizing, like I said, a lot of the stories in the Old Testament come from other cultures. Some of them, even like the Code of Hammurabi, is just a verbatim lift into Exodus. Uh, a lot of Deuteronomy, for example, comes from the treaty language of Esarhaddon, a king in Assyria, and to a greater extent than we realize, a lot of it comes from the Persians, both in the latter New Testament writings or Old Testament writings, and especially in New Testament theology. And that it's this interesting mix. And that's the way theology really works. That's the way religion really works. We're influenced not just by the past, but also our treatment of the past and what's around us and the analogies that we make, the connections that we make. And it happens to this day. Some people find that very offensive. They think that it is an assault on their religion if they think that there's foreign influences on their religion, but they're just being blind. It's like this idea of a false originalism. Many Christians think that the true church, the church of the first century and second century, and the church fathers, that's the true Christianity. We have to go back to that. Of course, the reformers, Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and others all were like pointing back, saying, but that's propaganda, because that wasn't true. There wasn't a truer Christianity. Christianity has always been malleable and has always changed. And that's the soup in which the Bible formed and our scriptures formed. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but I think it's really important that Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Return of the Exiles is super influential and influenced the Bible very much. Even the Deuteronomists and before that, when the priests wrote what's called the P, or the priestly aspects or insertions in the Old Testament, come from this period. And obviously, they're influenced by their culture and what's around them, just like it is for us. We do the same thing. We have taken American culture and we have Christianized it, and we've Americanized Christianity to a great extent. So, with that, I'll say, people say lots of things about the Bible that aren't really there, especially this idea of univocality and just a single line, a single intellectual line. No, it's way messier. There's way more influence than we realize. That, yeah, these characters feel real, especially returning exiles to people who, wait, we don't want you here. We already have this land. And the returning exiles impose their control on them. So people say that some of that's not true, but a lot of it is true. With that, I say thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.